Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are actually doing my most disappointing reads, the ones I really did not enjoy, didn't really even want to finish them, either took me really long or it was a struggle. So I have a handful, I'm not sure how many, but I'm going to be talking about them. These were all given either a 3 and under. Some of them I gave a 3 because I was able to finish them. It doesn't necessarily mean I would recommend it to everyone or that everyone would like them. But keep in mind, reading is so subjective. What I like might be something you don't like, or what you don't like I might love. So just keep that in mind. And I'll briefly explain why I didn't really enjoy them or what was so bad about the book. Let's get into the first one. The first book on my list is actually a Cassandra Clare book. So this author was the one that really got me into reading the Mortal Instruments series when I was younger. I flew through those books. I loved them. I love her Infernal Devices series, her Last Hour series I'll talk about a little bit later. But this book, The Red Scrolls of Magic, is a book she wrote, almost like a companion novel. Still follows the same world, but it talks about specific characters in kind of those bigger series. And this was actually co-written with Wesley Chu. So Red Scrolls of Magic is the first book in the Eldest Curses. I went into it because it was on my TBR one month. I think it was like end of last year, maybe October. I'll have to put in, it's up here, I remember. I'll have to put in what TBR video it is, but I'll put it up here. Yeah, so I went into this book. I knew there's probably going to be some action, but it did follow a character that wasn't necessarily my favorite in the rest of the series. I enjoyed him, don't get me wrong. It wasn't my favorite character, you know? And so going into it, it started off really slow. And if I'm being honest, the real action didn't even really start until 75% of the way through. 80% of the way through. Like the main plot point and like battle happened at the end of the book, and then it was like done. So it just was slow. I didn't really enjoy it. I still read it, obviously I completed it. It just wasn't my favorite book by her, and it wasn't needed. So just keep that in mind. Like, you don't need to read this book to understand the rest of her books. So read the back, see if you enjoy it. If you do, try it out. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. But for me, it just wasn't one of my favorites. So let's stick along with the same author. I mentioned the Last Hour series. This is the third book, and this is Chain of Thorns. This one came out last year. It was a very, very anticipated read for me. I loved Chain of Iron, Chain of Gold. I loved those. This let me down big time. I've talked about this book before. It's really big for not a lot happening. I can't talk too much about it because it is the third book. The first two books I loved. There was like a romance aspect, but there was still some action and like storyline that I really, really enjoyed. But with this book, it was just disappointing. There was so much information. It was information dumping. That's a good way to put it. A lot of information, not a whole lot happening. Also with the information, it just wasn't needed. Like, it was going into very, very high detail that it was just like, I was just reading words at that point. And so Chain of Thorns was not my favorite. I can't say don't read this series because of this book, because the first two books are like some of my favorite books she's ever written. So start with those, but just be prepared that this book is still good. The ending is still good. There's still action. It's just a lot of information. So keep that in mind, but don't let this deter you from reading the first two books, because I really enjoyed those. The next book I'm going to be talking about is a book, I'm not going to lie, I bought it for the cover, and you'll see why, and I'm keeping it because of the cover. This book I read last year, I think around like June or July. It was summertime, or no, sorry, 2 years ago. It's been a minute. 2 years ago I read this, One Italian Summer by Rebecca Sturl. Look at this cover. It has like that gold detail. I bought it because of the cover. The story, like, look at the book. It's very, very small. This one I have discussed a little bit. It talks about like this girl whose mother just recently like passed away, and so she had planned this trip to go on with her, and she's going through like some issues with her husband, and so she decides to still go on the trip, but she's like seeing her mom places, almost like it's in her head. The reason this is not one of my favorite books is just because of the plot. Kind of similar to the other ones, there just wasn't much happening, and the way the story was laid out was a little confusing to me. I felt like it could have had so much more. I loved the Italy aspect, like from going now and then looking back on this book, you really are put in Italy. Like, she discusses the cafes and, you know, the environment and her surroundings, which is very beautiful. It's just the plot line of this book and kind of how it was laid out. I can't really tell you much that happened because I don't remember. It didn't really stick with me. But One Italian Summer is a book that just wasn't my favorite, but maybe one of you would enjoy. It is a quick read, so it's not like it's gonna take a lot out of you. It's 200 pages. So the next book I have talked about, this one I read last year, and again, the cover is stunning. A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. I love Rebecca Ross's like books. I do. This book was beautifully written. I just don't remember anything about it. It was very hard for me to get through. This is a book that took me probably a week, if not a little bit more, to read. I just could not get through it. It was so bad. And looking back, this is a book I probably would have DNF'd. I've never DNF'd a book. I feel like once I start it, I should read it, but I'm trying to do better, that if I get to a book that's just really, really hard for me to get through, I'm gonna DNF it. This would have been a book I would have DNF'd because it was a struggle. I remember sitting in the living room like, oh, I just don't want to read it. My mom's like, then don't. I'm like, well, I have to finish it. Like, I'm already halfway through. So yes, I can't tell you much that happens. I know there's letters that are being like transferred. There's a river. That's it. But I have heard people that love this book. That's why I bought it. The cover's stunning, but also people that I've watched on YouTube recommended it. And so that's why I bought it, because I was like, well, the cover's stunning and this person loves this book. It's one of her favorite books. Wasn't for me. Might be for you, but it wasn't for me. It was very difficult for me to get through. Not one of my favorite reads. Very disappointing. All right. I'm smiling because this book, honestly, I might get rid of it because it was so not good, like, in my opinion. And that is Wreck the Halls by Tessa Bailey. I have read It Happened One Summer. I've read that book. I haven't read Hook, Line, and Sinker yet, but that book was fine. You know, it was my first like heavy romance book, so I was a little taken aback by some of the things that took place. But then this was my second book I read. I read this around Christmas time. Why is it a Christmas book? Because of the title? Because there's like nothing Christmassy about this. And maybe I should have read the back. I've said this before. Maybe if I would have read the back, I would have found that it just wasn't for me, but I didn't, because I like to go into my books with an open mind, no expectations, really not knowing much about it. I probably should have read the back of this book because I would not have picked it up and I would not have read it. It was just, nothing would have changed if I didn't read it, you know? It's kind of like a waste of space on my shelf. I actually have it behind books because it just wasn't good. It wasn't good to me. The chemistry, I felt like there was no chemistry in the characters. It's following like this girl who her parents, like her mom, had a band they want them to perform at the show, you know, the Wreck the Halls, you know. No. I'm sorry, but no thank you. If it wasn't so small, I probably would have DNF'd it, and I don't really remember much. I just probably will end up getting rid of this. Wreck the Halls. Okay, we're actually getting to our last two books that I have, you know, picked out in my mind. Maybe I'll think of some others. This book, I almost think it was more of a me situation and not the book, and maybe like the time I was reading it. That is The Stolen Heir by Holly Black. I don't think this was the first book I listened to audiobook. I think the first one was The Night Circus, but this one also was on Spotify for the audiobook. I was just very lost. I didn't really know what was happening. I can tell that I probably would like her other series, but this book I did not personally like myself. It just didn't really have me hooked. It was a thing of like, I just need to finish this book because it's on my TBR, you know? So it's a fantasy book. Yeah, I guess there's like a little smidget of like romance that you can kind of feel, but other than that, it's really not for me. Again, it might be a me thing to where I just wasn't hooked. I didn't really know what was happening. Maybe I wasn't paying attention enough, but The Stolen Heir was one that I probably wouldn't recommend personally. Maybe if I reread it and I knew what was happening, I'd recommend it. But for me, I don't know what's really going on, so I don't want to recommend it to you guys if I can't really remember much that happened. So this is the next book that just was like a little bit disappointing. I went into it with high hopes. I love fantasy, and it just didn't do it for me. Okay. This is the last book that I have laid out. I'll do another scan through to see if I find anything else, but this is a recent read, and this is one that was anticipated and it let me down. I went into it with high hopes because of the first book. I really loved the first book, and this was not the case for this one. So If Only I Had Told Her by Laura Nolan. I'm sure you guys have heard of this book, and if you watched my like recent reading vlog, I read this book and I went into it with the expectations of crying, sobbing, basically just destroying me. It didn't do that. I thought it was going to be all of Finney's point of view. I thought that's what it was going to be because the first one was all of Autumn's point of view and their relationship. I thought this was going to be him. It wasn't. The first like 100 pages was his perspective, and then it went into two other characters for like the next 100 and then the 100 after that. Yeah, the first 100 pages I liked because I love Finney. The second like part, I could do without that character. I felt like it was very unnecessary. Like, I don't hate the character, but I just don't see the point of putting his perspective in. And then the last point of view was fine. I enjoyed that I got to see more of the story and kind of what they were going through, and the topic she discussed that people go through, I think was very important, and I liked that she talked about them. But overall, this book was just very disappointing for me, and if I were to redo it, I probably wouldn't even read this book and I'd just stay with the first one. The first one's amazing. Go read that one if he had been with me. Read that book and probably just, I mean, look into this, see if you want to read it. It's not terrible. It just wasn't what I wanted from the book. Yeah. I did find another book really quickly. This one is good. It just wasn't my favorite. I went into it thinking it was going to be one of my favorite fantasy books of all time because of a different booktuber I saw read this book. She's actually the one that liked A River Enchanted and this book, and that's why I bought them. We just don't like the same things, I think. Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This book was fun, fantasy filled, a little bit of romance, but I think at the time I love a good mixture of romance and fantasy. This one there was hardly any romance, and the fantasy aspect just wasn't my favorite. So I think that made it hard, because don't get me wrong, I love like Throne of Glass. The Throne of Glass series really isn't romance heavy, and I ate those up. I think it just depends on how the fantasy aspect is written, and this book just wasn't for me. I would recommend it because this is one of, you know, the higher rated disappointing books, and I'm not gonna, you know, ding it for maybe it just wasn't my cup of tea. This is a book I won't get rid of because I did enjoy it. It just wasn't what I was expecting when I went into it, and that's okay, you know? It's okay not to like and love every book. I want to throw in a thriller. Not that this is terrible, but this is probably my least favorite thriller on my bookshelf, and that is The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. Now, I just want to mention, my toxic trait, I think, is buying anything that has Paris or Italy in the title. Candles. If it says, I just bought a candle that says Springtime in Paris, I had to buy it. This one Italian Summer. It's just my toxic trait. Anyway, I digress. This book was one of the first thrillers I read, and going into it, it was creepy. It was interesting. I was very confused. I wanted to know what was happening. But the plot twist, I think, is where it kind of went downhill, because when we learned it, it was just like, really? Like, that's it. Like, that's seriously? Like, it just was very underwhelming. Now, The Guest List by Lucy Foley I would recommend over this book. This book's still good. It's still creepy. It just is not my favorite thriller, and whenever I talk about thrillers or think of thrillers, this is not one of the books I think about. Anyway, to throw in a thriller, this is probably the least favorite thriller I've read, and it's The Paris Apartment. All right. That is it for this video. We have a chunky stack, sadly, of disappointing books. Now, I just want to say one more time, these books, it's subjective. So don't take this the wrong way. Don't let it deter you if you're like, oh my gosh, I bought one of these books and now I'm scared to read it because what if I don't like it? Don't think that way. Everyone is different. Like I said, 2 of these books are a booktuber's favorite books of all time. Like, that's why I bought them. They just weren't personally for me, and that's okay. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Let me know any of like your most disappointing reads, even if it's like a really popular book and you're just like, this was not good. Let me know, because that's so interesting to me. And if you want to see this video in like my favorite books of all time, or, you know, the most interesting books or books that I would most likely recommend, let me know, because I'd love to do this. These videos are nice and easy, but it's fun, if that makes sense. Like, I get to look back on all my reads and in this sense remember how disappointed I was. But anyway, I will see you in the next video. Bye.